Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now on Morning News Now, block the vote. Dozens of Democratic lawmakers from the Lone Star State are in our nation's capital this morning, all part of an effort to block their Republican colleagues from enacting new voting restrictions. The future of Texas politics as the GOP fights back against the move. Cause for concern. A new warning from the FDA now slapped onto Johnson & Johnson's COVID vaccine. The agency flagging a heightened risk of developing a rare neurological condition. What you need to know about the one-stop shop this morning. The fight for change. Thousands of demonstrators are taking to the streets in Cuba, protesting a lasting economic crisis and botched pandemic response. Cuba's president now blaming the U.S. for continued sanctions. We'll bring you the latest from Havana. And wake-up call. An untimely jolt in the cost of coffee slated to hit when many caffeine connoisseurs head back into the office. We'll spill the beans on the source of this latest price hike and how much you might have to shell out for a cup of Joe. And that story will come to us from Joe.
Yes, cup of Joe by Joe.
Which is also just sounds like really bad news for us. With our
it could be. It's not going to be awful necessarily. It could be okay.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thanks.
We'll tease.
We'll get to that in a little bit, but we begin with the latest effort by Texas Democrats to fight Republican-backed voting restrictions in the state.
Yeah, in a dramatic move, dozens of Democratic lawmakers fled Texas Monday afternoon, flying to D.C. on a pair of charter jets. The legislators plan to stay there until the special legislative session ends, which is in August. Their goal is to keep Texas Republicans from passing their agenda by making sure they don't have a quorum. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson is outside the Texas state capitol this morning. So, Priscilla, we know these lawmakers landed at Dulles Airport near D.C. last night. They're likely going to stay in Washington for a while. What did they say about their decision to flee Texas?
Well, Savannah, Joe, good morning. So one Democratic lawmaker I spoke with told me that had those public hearings not gone the way they did this weekend, this may not have happened. But whenever those hearings went for hours, hundreds of people showed up to testify, largely in opposition to these bills. And Democrats saw that Republicans still passed these bills out of committee along a party line vote with no amendments. They decided that they needed to act. And of course, we heard from those Democratic lawmakers when those planes landed in Washington, D.C. late last night. And I want to play a little bit of what they had to say.
Today, more than 50 Democratic members of the Texas House left Austin and left Texas. Not because we want to. It breaks our heart that we have to do it. But we do it because we are in a fight to save our democracy. The nationwide Republican vote suppression efforts, anti-voter efforts, is coming to a crisis point in the state of Texas right now.
We're here today because our backs have been against the wall. We had no other option. There was nothing left to give. And so we took a stand and we left the state of Texas because that was the best and the right thing to do at the right time.
And the president will be delivering remarks on voting rights later today. Democratic lawmakers from Texas are certainly going to be watching that speech very closely. I'm told that they want to hear him say in no uncertain terms that to call on Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and also the For the People Act. Joe?
Let's talk about the Republican response. Governor Greg Abbott called this special session after Democrats walked out in May to stop a vote on these voting restrictions. Then now he's threatening some serious consequences. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Governor Greg Abbott is certainly not happy with this dramatic exit that Democrats staged on yesterday. And he says that this is not over. I want to play a little bit of what he had to say on Fox News last night.
Isn't that the most un-Texan thing you've ever heard? Texans running from a fight? They're quitters. State House of Representatives who are here in the Capitol in Austin right now, they do have the ability to issue a call to have their fellow members who are not showing up to be arrested, but only so long as that arrest is made in the state of Texas. That's why they have fled the state. Once they step back into the state of Texas, they will be arrested and brought to the Texas Capitol, and we will be conducting business.
And Abbott says he will continue to call special sessions until his agenda has been addressed. Joe?
So, Priscilla, what is next for these Texas Democrats in D.C., their Republican counterparts back home in Texas? Where could things go from here?
Well, those Texas Democrats will be in D.C., they say, through the first week in August, lobbying federal legislators to take action on that voting rights legislation. As for what happens here, right now, the Texas House does not have enough people to have a quorum. We do expect them to gavel in later today, at which point the House Speaker could set into motion the process of ensuring that if those Democrats do return to Texas during the special session, they could be arrested and brought back here to the Capitol. Joe?
Will be an interesting few weeks. Priscilla Thompson in Austin. Priscilla, thank you.
And as Texas Democrats wake up in Washington, President Biden heads to Philadelphia, where he's expected to give a speech attacking restrictive election laws in GOP-led states and calling for a national coalition to boost voting rights. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now from Philadelphia. Mike, good morning. And you just had a new piece drop on NBCnews.com like 2 hours ago. So here we are with the exclusive first chat with you. So thanks for joining us. All right. So what is President Biden expected to say to raise the stakes for voting rights reform on the federal level?
Well, Savannah, you just were talking about that big, bold, dramatic gesture that Texas Democrats, feeling that their voting rights are really under siege in that state, made. And a lot of progressive activists and even some of the president's allies are wondering why the president isn't showing the same kind of urgency at the federal level. Well, the White House says you're going to see that from the president today. Yes, he is going to voice support for the For the People Act. But today, the White House sees this speech as an important opportunity for Biden to take a much longer view. This is a political fight that they think will be waged all the way through the midterm elections. They want to show that there's a price to pay politically for Republicans who are pursuing these kind of changes. They're not ruling out continuing to press ahead with federal legislation, though, as White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki laid out just yesterday. Take a listen.
We don't accept the notion, he's an optimist by nature, otherwise he wouldn't be sitting in the Oval Office right now, that it's dead. We don't accept that. We believe there needs to be a path forward. The president sees his role as somebody who can speak from the bully pulpit to elevate and advocate for the need to move forward on voting rights legislation.
You heard her use that term, bully pulpit, the White House saying that this speech will really not mince words. He will call the kind of Republican voting changes we're seeing across the country un-American, undemocratic, unpatriotic. But the White House sees this not as a speech directed at the partisan activists who've been really engaged in this, but for the ordinary Americans who maybe haven't been paying attention to this on a day-to-day basis.
Right. OK, so now let's talk through, what can happen from here. House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn's endorsement was, of course, a turning point in Joe Biden's campaign to win the Democratic nomination. I mean, it wasn't really until this that we saw this really pick up steam for him. Now the congressman is turning up the heat on President Biden and asking him to push for filibuster reform. So first, how's the White House handling that particular pressure?
Yeah, it's so interesting to see when Jim Clyburn uses that political capital that he has with this White House to pressure them to take certain actions. And he also didn't mince words when I talked to him about this White House approach, trying to take a longer view, focus on the midterms. And he said to me that if we mess up this voting thing, as he put it, we're not going to see Raphael Warnock get reelected to the Senate. We're not going to win a Senate election in North Carolina, in Florida. So he thinks that the president needs to take much more urgent action now. And that's why the White House's approach is to try to make sure that there's popular support beyond Washington for the kind of dramatic steps, including filibuster reforms, that would be required in order to make sure that that For the People Act specifically can get over the finish line. We know it just got barely those 50 Democratic votes when it came up a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. Even if the president got on board with filibuster reform, they'd need every Democratic senator on board, which of course includes Senators Manchin and Sinema, to get 50 votes to pass. What's the White House working to specifically get that support on voting rights reform?
Well, I spoke with Cedric Richmond, former congressman who's now a senior advisor in the White House, and he said, listen, I understand these activists want the president out there giving these big speeches every day. He said if they wanted a president who was out there just sort of blowing hot air, they had that in the last president, that this president needs to get credit for articulating a strategy, working behind the scenes to get support from key senators like Joe Manchin. They point out that they didn't have 50 votes for the People Act just even hours before that vote in the Senate a few weeks ago. It was the president working behind behind the scenes talking with Senator Manchin, who Richmond said talks to him very regularly, that made sure they got that 50th vote. And now you build from that process potentially for some tweaks in the filibuster, like ending the talking filibuster.
Mike Memoli, as always, stellar reporting. Thank you for joining us.
The FDA is adding a new warning for Johnson & Johnson's coronavirus vaccine. The agency says the shot has been linked to a rare but serious side effect, a neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Only about 100 cases have been reported out of the more than 12 million Americans who've received the J&J vaccine. NBC News health and medical reporter Erica Edwards is following the latest on the pandemic this morning. So, Erica, tell us more. What is this syndrome, and how are officials connecting it to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Right. Good morning, Joe. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a neurologic condition in which the immune system actually attacks nerve cells. That can lead to muscle weakness and paralysis in some parts of the body. Now, those symptoms often pass within a few weeks. It's usually not permanent. It is most common in adults over age 50. Now, anytime a person develops a problem after a vaccine, it's reported to an online safety monitoring system called VAERS. And that's where health officials scour that information, that database, to look for any patterns of problems. That's where they picked up on these rare cases, these 100 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, I should point out that this link has not been definitively proven. Those cases are still considered preliminary and under investigation. Joe.
And Erica, what is Johnson & Johnson saying about this?
The company said that it had already been in communication with the FDA about these cases. It released a statement that read, in part, "We strongly support raising awareness of the signs and symptoms of rare events to ensure that they can be quickly identified and effectively treated." Joe.
So, Erica, let's take a look at the bigger picture here. This FDA warning is the latest blow to this vaccine that's easy to dole out because it requires only one dose. Can you remind us some of the other issues surrounding J&J's shot and the likelihood of someone getting any of those side effects?
Right. Well, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was actually paused for 11 days in April after it was linked to rare reports of blood clots. The FDA later added a warning about that outcome as well. Now, both of these potential problems are extremely rare. In fact, those 100 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome would represent less than 1/1000% of the more than 12.8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that have already been administered. Joe.
Let's talk about another one of the vaccines, Pfizer. Pfizer met with federal health officials yesterday to talk about booster shots. Pfizer wants regulators to approve its booster dose soon. But do experts think we need it at all?
At this point, no. Late last night, a spokesperson for the Department of Health and Human Services reiterated that at this point, there is no evidence that we will need a booster dose. Now, the vaccine is working well, even against the Delta variant. Pfizer, for its part, said it will publish data from its trials of a booster dose in the near future. Joe?
All right. We know we'll be talking about that one for quite a while. Erica, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll stay on that now with Israel offering a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine to some citizens as the Delta variant spreads across the country. NBC News global correspondent Rafael Sanchez joins us now. Hi, Raf. Good morning. Good to see you. So this makes Israel the first country to give out a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine, but it's not for everyone. I mean, as we just heard, though, from Erica Edwards, that this is not something that we're doing at this time here in the U.S. So tell us more about what's happening there, who these boosters are being made available to, and what research there is there to support this move. How'd they make this decision?
Savannah, that's right. We're here at Sheba Hospital, and yesterday at this site, the first people in the world to get that third dose of the Pfizer vaccine. But that booster only going to people who are severely immunocompromised, so they have weakened immune systems. So they started here with people who recently had heart transplants. They're going to go on to people who had liver and kidney transplants. After that, they're moving on to those getting chemotherapy for cancer. But it was two pieces of research from here in Israel that sparked the decision to go ahead with the booster. The first, they found that many of these immunocompromised people, even after being fully vaccinated, were not developing the levels of antibodies that doctors wanted to see. So some of the most vulnerable people in the population, not as protected as we would like. The second piece, Israel finding that 6 months or so after being fully vaccinated with Pfizer, people's antibody levels starting to decrease, not dramatically, but that is is leading to a conversation about whether we need that booster shot. Now, I spoke to a senior official here at the hospital earlier. I asked him, you're starting with this immunocompromised population, but where do you see this going? Take a listen to what he had to say.
Their immune response is in many ways suppressed. That's part of their disease or their treatment. So those are the most prone ones to get, I would say, a severe form of COVID-19. So it's very logical to start with them the vaccination process. Although if you ask my personal opinion, I believe we will end up vaccinating again the entire Israeli population.
So, Savannah, that is only his personal population, but that is a very senior official at an Israeli state hospital saying they're beginning with the immunocompromised. He sees them going next to the over 65s, eventually to the entire Israeli population getting a booster shot. And as we've seen again and again throughout the pandemic, Israel often sets the example that the U.S. and other countries then follow. Savannah?
So that is the plan then, that this third dose would be available to the general public?
It's not the plan, but that is the conversation here. And individual experts like the official here at Sheba saying that is looking like it may very well be the trajectory here in Israel. A booster dose for the entire population.
Wow. So, Raph, that's obviously ahead of where we're at here in the United States. I mean, as I just mentioned a second ago, as we heard from Erica Edwards, that's not what we're thinking at this point. U.S. health officials are saying, nope, you don't need it. Something else, though, that we're kind of seeing a little bit ahead of us in Israel, of course, was the vaccination rollout. More than 80% of Israeli adults have been fully vaccinated. But now we're also still seeing those coronavirus cases increasing in large part because of the Delta variant, as we've been talking about. So break down the numbers for us. And what does that situation there in Israel indicate about the effectiveness of the vaccine if cases are rising when 80% of adults are vaccinated?
Yeah, Savannah. So two big findings from a recent study by the Israeli Health Ministry. The first, the Pfizer vaccine less effective at stopping infection with the Delta variant compared to earlier versions of the virus, down from the 90% range to the mid-60s. So every day in Israel, we are seeing hundreds of these breakthrough cases, people fully vaccinated going on to test positive. But the second finding, Israeli authorities would say the more important one, very few of those people getting seriously ill. Less than 50 people across the entire country in hospital right now with serious COVID. And that, they say, is a sign the vaccines are working. Savannah.
All right. That's great news still, and such important context. Raph, thank you so much.
Widespread drought and record-breaking heat are fueling dozens of wildfires this morning. They're burning all across the West Coast, from California to Washington State. NBC News national correspondent Miguel Almaguer has the latest on the fight to save homes and lives.
These are the apocalyptic conditions firefighters in Northern California face, a perfect recipe for disaster. Fueled by scorching temperatures and extreme drought, the Beckworth Complex fire doubled in size Saturday, grew by 20,000 acres Sunday, and forced some to run for their lives.
I'd planned on staying, but when you see the firemen running like that, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and leave.
58 wildfires are burning across the West. The bootleg fire in Oregon, the nation's largest, is racing out of control.
Normally we see fire behavior like this in these big fires, not until August or September.
Extreme heat is also cooking the region.
This is a climate crisis.
Scientists say this is a clear hallmark of climate change. After the hottest June on record, Las Vegas and St. George, Utah hit weekend records of 117 degrees. Death Valley, an unbearable 130.
We're heating up the planet and changing the climate in a way that humans have never experienced before. And we're already dealing with the consequences. So it's a question of how bad do we want it to get?
The extreme heat is fueling this epic drought, and these conditions now surround more homes than ever. A catastrophic combination for fire season.
An ominous forecast as we enter a hot, dangerous, and already destructive summer. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
From the dangerous heat in the west to flooding in the east, there's a lot going on. Let's check on your Morning News Now weather.
There has been a lot going on for a long time. Bill Cairns, good morning.
I know it doesn't. I have to appreciate the slow days when I get them because I forget what it's like sometimes in this summer. I know it's not even the peak of the hurricane season yet either. So, all right, so let's get to the fire information. We put this map together for you to show you where all the large blazes are burning right now in the West. And it's pretty widespread. I mean, from the mountains in Arizona to spotted the hills in California. I mean, look at northern Idaho and portions of western Montana with a concentration of blazes. So what we have is 50 large uncontained fires right now. So that means the firefighters do not have the containment lines around them. They are free to burn in any direction they want, depending on the wind and the weather. And right now, we're at a national preparedness of level 4. Now, level 5 is the highest, so we're almost there. And the bootleg fire in southern Oregon is by far the biggest in the country. It's at least double the size of any other one, 0% containment, and 50 structures are lost. To give you an idea, there are 1,000 firefighters on that bootleg fire alone. I mean, there's a lot of firefighter resources out there trying to get these blazes under control. So for today, the heat numbers are going down. As we mentioned yesterday, slowly it's getting a little bit cooler. That heat dome is weakening. It's still hot, but it's not as exceptionally hot, guys, as it was in areas of the West. And we did mention the East, and you guys mentioned it too, the endless days of rain. And again today, a chance of some severe weather in areas of western New York and Pennsylvania. In Boston, it has rained every single day so far in July, guys. Wow. And it's already their third wettest July ever on record.
Ugh, that's miserable. All right, Bill, thanks. We'll see you next hour.
Yep.
Tensions are rising in Cuba. Thousands are protesting the island's food and medicine shortages as the ongoing economic crisis there worsens. And in places like Miami, they're showing support, holding demonstrations, and demanding an end to the 62-year-old dictatorship. NBC News Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell has more on how U.S. leaders are responding.
Thousands of demonstrators spilling into the streets of Cuba this weekend, calling for an end to the 62-year communist regime. Chants of "We want freedom" echoing through the streets. Protesters dumping trash and throwing rocks. Demonstrations sparked by chronic food shortages and blackouts. In Miami, protests in solidarity with Havana.
We've been waiting for change for so long.
Maria Figueroa has family in Cuba.
I don't even know what their situation is right now.
An economic crisis exacerbated by the pandemic and no access to approved COVID vaccines. A perfect storm for anti-regime anger that spread rapidly as more Cubans recently gained access to the internet. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel today blaming the unrest on U.S. sanctions.
The lack of medicine and food, all those topics that are embedded in our society as dissatisfaction, what is the origin? It's a blockade.
They simply are not hearing the voices and will of the Cuban people. People deeply, deeply, deeply tired of the repression.
President Obama established diplomatic relations with Cuba and removed it from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. But the Trump administration put Cuba back on that list, imposing tougher sanctions, which President Biden has not lifted.
We call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence, their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Our thanks to Andrea Mitchell for that report. Coming up, a symbolic end to America's war in Afghanistan. The U.S.'s top commander there now stepping down. Our exclusive interview up next. CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie has officially assumed responsibility for U.S. forces in Afghanistan, taking over from General Scott Miller. The transfer of command comes as U.S. troops pull out of the country while the Taliban continues to make rapid gains. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kuby reports from Kabul.
A ceremony in Kabul marked the symbolic end of the war in Afghanistan. General Scott Miller handed over the reins of U.S. forces in Afghanistan to CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie, who sought to reassure Afghans nervous about the U.S. withdrawal.
You can count on our support in the dangerous and difficult days ahead. We will be with you.
With them, but in dwindling numbers. President Biden declared the U.S. military would be completely out of Afghanistan by August 31st, but nearly all U.S. troops and equipment have left already. At the same time, a Taliban offensive has been sweeping across the country, threatening key cities, as the Afghan military no longer has American advisors.
if this government is overthrown, if the Taliban prevail, I think we can expect a return to medieval standards here in Afghanistan.
General McKenzie with a stark warning, saying the Taliban have their sights set on taking over Kabul and toppling the central government.
I think there's a real possibility of falling into a civil war. I think that is certainly very possible.
Meanwhile, General Miller, who ran the war in Afghanistan longer than any other commander, leaving Kabul unlikely to return.
You've been here for almost 3 years. I mean, what does it feel like to be leaving for the last time?
Well, it's a little bit different to be leaving for the last time, certainly, and that'll be something, again, just process over time.
After nearly 2 decades, America's longest war coming to a solemn and uncertain close. Courtney Cuby, NBC News, Kabul, Afghanistan.
Let's stay on international news and see what else is happening around the world this morning. Janice Mackey-Freyer joins us. Hi, Janice. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. We begin with a tragic story in southern Iraq where a fire ripped through a COVID ward in a hospital, killing at least 64 people. This happened in the city of Nasiriyah, and the death toll is expected to rise as recovery operations continue there. 16 people were rescued from the burning building. The cause is not yet clear, but police suggested an oxygen tank exploding inside the building is to blame. Sadly, there's precedent. At least 80 people were killed in a Baghdad hospital back in April because oxygen tanks were not properly stored. In France, restaurants, cafes, shopping centers, they are all going to have restricted access to try to get a rise in COVID cases under control. Only people who have been vaccinated or who can show a negative COVID test will be allowed into those venues, starting with cultural venues hosting more than 50 people. President Emmanuel Macron says it's necessary for France to avoid another full-out lockdown. And it's a similar drive underway in Greece, where bars, cinemas, theaters, shopping malls, you have to be vaccinated to go into any of those places as well. They're making vaccinations mandatory for anybody who works in Greece's tourism industry. And finally, a high-profile heist at the Cannes Film Festival. Jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars was stolen from the hotel room of actress Jodie Turner-Smith. It happened in broad daylight at a beachfront Marriott. It was reported to police last Friday. It is the 5th major theft in the last 8 years. Not surprising, given all of the baubles that celebrities are known to borrow and wear there. However, in this case, it was mostly family jewelry that was taken, including her mother's wedding ring. And that's a look at what's happening around the world.
Oh, my goodness. That is awful that it was that family jewelry. That is crazy. Oh, all right, Janice, thank you so much.
Apparently, she had appeared on the red carpet with a lot of jewelry, so the thieves might have thought it was still in her room.
Yeah, wow. Oof, that's sad. All right, thank you so much. Coming up, Hunter Biden is under the microscope yet again, but this time it's over his art. We'll explain after this. The Washington Monument is expected to reopen Wednesday after a 6-month closure because of the pandemic. Visitors will have to wear masks regardless of vaccination status, according to the National Park Service. They also need to book tickets in advance online. Now, the monument originally shut down, as much of the country did, in March of 2020, briefly reopening that October before it closed again this January. Almost all the sites on the National Mall have now reopened, and D.C. is trying to bring back tourists after losing billions in visitor spending during the pandemic. Look at that. That's a beautiful shot. All right. Now, ethics watchdogs are blasting the secret sale of art by President Biden's son, Hunter. His work could rake in $500,000 apiece, but the arrangement raises concerns that buying this art could look like buying access to the president himself. Here's NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk with more.
Powerful and impactful work, according to the gallery owner who will sell Hunter Biden's art this fall. Art critics aren't so sure.
Well, it's not as bad as I might have thought.
Others have been tougher, one calling it hotel art. But the gallery says it values some of the first-time artist paintings up to $500,000.
You could get a work by Matisse or Degas for a similar amount of money.
How much of that is the name?
Almost all of it, I'd say.
The sale triggering criticism of a White House that touts itself as the most ethical administration in history.
I think the right thing to do would have been for White House ethics officials to try to talk the president into begging his son not to go through with this sale.
Walter Schaub was director of government ethics under President Obama.
Don't the children of presidents have the right to pursue a career?
The children of presidents have the absolute right to pursue a career, but as citizens of this country, they really have a moral and ethical duty not to trade on their parents' public service.
There is also concern that someone might try to gain influence with the president by buying his son's art.
I can tell you that after careful consideration, a system has been established that allows for Hunter Biden to work in his profession within reasonable safeguards.
First reported by the Washington Post, the administration has made an agreement with the gallery not to reveal buyers' names to anyone, including Hunter Biden or the White House.
This is an amateur mistake because there's no way to control what the purchasers do. They can go out and tell the world that they bought this art.
Hunter Biden has previously come under fire, including for taking a lucrative board position at Ukrainian gas company Burisma, while his father was VP. But he is also not alone. Past presidents' children, including the Trumps, have raised ethics concerns. In this case, experts say more transparency would help.
The American people deserve the opportunity to be able to track whether or not these purchasers are getting preferential access to government.
Not saying who is buying the art, Schaub says, is the problem. Stephanie Gosk, NBC News, New York.
Thank you, Stephanie. Now, coming up for all your workday warriors out there, I've got some unfortunate news. Higher coffee prices may be brewing. We'll tell you what's behind this post-pandemic surge in cost up next. We're taking a closer look at the growing marijuana industry in our series Red, White, and Green. Marijuana plays a major medical role in treatment plans for many patients. But what happens when doctors can't answer questions about those treatments? NBC News Now correspondent Isa Gutierrez has more on the information gap.
Even though medical marijuana is legal in 36 states and the District of Columbia, patients say their doctors don't know that much about it.
It really was out of desperation that I tried it.
Sherry Berman is a two-time cancer survivor. In 1998, she says she tried cannabis as a last-ditch attempt to treat side effects from her chemo.
Within minutes, I felt better, my nausea went away, and it stimulated my appetite so I could eat.
Not an uncommon effect for cannabis users, but the federal government still classifies it as Schedule 1 with, quote, no currently accepted medical use. In 2018, 6 years after medical marijuana became legal in her home state of Massachusetts, Sherry decided to get a medical card to help her manage the chronic pain from past treatment. But she said what she found was unsettling. Doctors she spoke with had seemingly little or no knowledge of the drug.
One of my questions was, does cannabis interact with my statin, which I was on for high cholesterol? And he said to me, I have no idea. I don't know anything about drug interactions. It shouldn't be a problem.
She's not alone. Studies show there's a gap between what patients want to know about using cannabis and the information their doctors can actually provide them. A 2017 study found only 9% of medical schools had any curriculum on medical cannabis.
And so the physicians are at a loss. They don't want to lead their patients astray.
Dr. Ziva Cooper is the director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative.
The physicians' hesitancy, it's justified.
One way states and dispensaries are seeking to close the information gap, requiring a licensed pharmacist, like Gauguin Pour Sforza, to be on site to help customers.
So my first question is usually what brings you here. The second question is typically what's your experience, because I need to know if you think you know what you're doing or if you do actually know what you're doing. And then the third, which is where really my qualifications come into track, are really just your medications.
Pour Sforza says unlike conventional medicine, plant-based medicines such as cannabis impact individuals differently, meaning there aren't standard dosing recommendations.
The question mark is always there. Could it help? Maybe it could help. We've seen one person, who's had some benefit and then one person who hasn't.
Those we spoke with agreed that removing obstacles to cannabis research would generate more data for medical providers to consider.
Truth is that the science at this point in time is kind of even guided by the industry.
The Food and Drug Administration has not approved a, quote, marketing application for the treatment of any disease or condition. And with the exception of one product, no cannabis, cannabis-derived, or CBD products currently available on the market have been FDA approved. And that's a challenge for researchers.
Even though, I'm in Los Angeles and there are dispensaries all over the place that are offering these products, those products aren't necessarily meeting the standards that are required to do a human study, a clinical study.
But a provision included in House Democrats' infrastructure bill last month would allow some products already on shelves in dispensaries to be used for research in federally funded labs. It's specifically for driving impairment, but the language is broad enough that it might impact other studies. Dr. Cooper told us that while this move signals a shift in perspective on cannabis research, it's unlikely to be a game changer for clinical trial research.
None of these products in dispensaries, as of yet, have been studied rigorously.
In May, the DEA announced it would issue licenses to a number of marijuana-growing facilities to supply cannabis for research. Since 1968, the University of Mississippi has been the only source of cannabis for U.S. medical researchers. For Sherry Berman, a lack of information forced her to find answers without the help of her doctor. Now she's getting her master's in cannabis and science therapeutics and launched a consultation practice to give others the help she didn't receive.
In an ideal world, I do believe that my personal doctor should have knowledge about cannabis medicine. So to have my primary care physician or other physicians removed from that process doesn't seem like that's in my best interest as a patient.
If you're having your morning coffee right now, you may want to listen up. Global coffee prices are on the rise, and in the next few months, that delicious cup could get more expensive. We take a closer look at what's driving the spike and what you need to know. Higher prices could be brewing for coffee lovers. The reason for a possible caffeine spike? Rising global coffee prices, fueled by dwindling supply and growing demand.
We have consistently seen the price of coffee get higher and higher.
World coffee production for this year is expected to be down 11 million bags from last year, largely to blame a devastating drought in Brazil, the world's largest supplier of coffee beans. The International Coffee Organization estimates that nearly a third of the country's Arabica crop for 2021-2022 was lost because of the dry spell. Like many other industries, pandemic-fueled global supply chain issues, including shipping container shortages and jammed ports, are only making matters worse. Even ahead of this news, you've likely already noticed your coffee is getting pricier. According to the Wall Street Journal, the average coffee drink at a cafe is about $4.50. 5 years ago, it was $3.85, a 17% hike, more than the rate of inflation. So when and where might you feel the latest jolt in price? Not immediately. Bigger coffee companies usually negotiate rates years out to avoid market volatility, and several coffee shops we spoke to say they already pay over market value for high-quality beans and don't expect what's happening in Brazil to have an immediate impact on prices. Verve Coffee in California says they buy high-quality beans directly from producers around the world, that the higher price of coffee is impacting their business now. They'll raise their prices next month, the first increase in 5 years.
Coffee is such an integral part of people's day-to-day life that most people are willing to pay the extra quarter or 50 cents for that daily cup of coffee.
A sentiment that others who run on coffee seem to agree with.
I'll absolutely keep drinking coffee.
It would take a lot more than maybe like a quarter rise in price to stop me from drinking coffee.
Coffee is definitely something I cannot live without.
You're here. All right. Coming up, President Biden's plea to federal and local leaders to, quote, come together on gun control.
This, though, as troubling new data on unintentional shootings by children is revealed. That is up next.
President Biden is pitching a new plan to local leaders in their efforts to curb the surge of gun violence.
We recognize that we have to come together to fulfill the first responsibility of a democracy. That's to keep each other safe. And that's what the American people are looking for when it comes to reducing violent crime and gun violence.
Part of the national gun violence epidemic is the number of kids involved in accidental shootings. So far this year alone, some 167 children have pulled the trigger. That's according to the gun safety advocacy group Everytown. NBC News Now correspondent Mara Barrett spoke with a family whose life changed forever when their son found a gun.
The way it was explained to me by the officers, they figured that it slipped in his hands and his fingers hit the trigger and the gun went off. And when it went off, it shot through the inner corner of Eli's right eye, exited behind his right ear, and embedded in the wall behind him.
When he was just a toddler, Eli Parker accidentally shot himself in the head with an unsecured gun.
I just was naive enough to think that anyone who my children would be around would be responsible adults.
Since 2002, when this happened, Eli's had many surgeries, wears a prosthetic eye, and he and his mom, Haley, still deal with PTSD.
The few inklings of what I would call a memory that I have are spotty at best. Ambulance ride, television, and the layout of the bedroom are about all I remember.
But the ability for children to access guns and cause unintentional injuries is a problem that still persists today.
Breaking news, a mother is in custody after an 8-year-old accidentally shot a 12-year-old last week.
Police say this was an accident, and both the suspect and victim are children.
These incidents from last week alone. An estimated 4.6 million American children live in homes with at least one gun that is loaded and unlocked. Everytown, a gun safety advocacy group, has been tracking unintentional shootings by children. Just this year, they've counted at least 167 of them, resulting in 64 deaths and 112 injuries nationally. They also found that between March and December of 2020, prime pandemic lockdown period, there was a 32% increase in unintentional shooting deaths by children, of themselves and others, compared to the same time period in 2019.
They had always assured me, we're not ever going to have anything down where they can touch it, and we keep it all locked up. And I mean, they had a gun safe, so I was foolish enough to trust them.
Haley isn't the only mom in the dark. Research from Northeastern this spring found that 70% of parents believe their children can't access the guns they keep in their homes. But their kids say otherwise. More than 1/3 of teens say they could get a hold of a loaded gun kept in the home in less than 5 minutes.
A tear, his little bloody tear ran out of his eye, and he said, "Mommy, I'm so sorry." That was the first words he said to me when he came out of that coma. And I just broke down and I told him, I said, "You have nothing to be sorry about. This is not your fault. This is the irresponsible gun owner's fault."
We know from modeling that even a modest increase in safe storage in homes would significantly decrease injury and mortality to youth.
Gun safety advocates are pushing for child access prevention laws. This would allow prosecutors to bring charges against adults who unintentionally or carelessly allow children to have unsupervised access to guns. Their simple solution, requiring gun locks or gun safes in homes where underage children live. But some people push back.
I ran to my front door loading the gun as I ran. I could have shaved 90 seconds off if my firearm had been loaded and not locked behind a giant steel door.
Saying if their gun was locked away, they wouldn't be able to access it quickly enough in an emergency or for self-defense. Haley now works as an advocate for the Be Smart campaign with Everytown. She emphasizes that she always asks about the presence of guns in other people's homes. Right now, 30 states have a range of these laws in place, but only 17 states and Washington, D.C. put criminal liability on people who negligently store firearms. The potential for bipartisanship seen in the variety of the political ideology in states who have stricter laws. But in some cases, in states without these laws, the children can even be charged.
We don't think it was a premeditated, that their intent was to actually kill Mr. Smith. But, when you fire a firearm in the direction of another person in a reckless manner, then that is considered involuntary manslaughter.
The sheriff says under South Carolina law, a child younger than 10 can't be arrested. He says the children are with their parents as these court proceedings continue.
There has to be accountability somewhere, and I do not think that it should be placed on the child.
If they get access to someone else's weapon, the blame should fall on the person who owns it. That's how it is with homeowners insurance, car insurance, or any other thing that you would own if somebody else gets hurt on it.
Democrats on the Hill reintroduced a federal safe storage bill this past session, putting the spotlight on what advocates say needs to be a bipartisan effort when Congress returns.
They call him the mighty Quinn. We're talking about 5-year-old Quinn Waters, whose battle against recurring brain tumors has made him a bit of a legend in the Boston area.
Yeah, last Saturday, the Red Sox gave Quinn a special honor, throwing out the first pitch at Fenway Park. NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt has this story.
Hi, Joe and Savannah. I want to tell you about the 5-year-old boy who has shown so much bravery taking the field at Fenway Park and inspiring America. For anyone, a trip to the ballpark can be a special day. And for Massachusetts native Quinn Waters, throwing out the first pitch for the Boston Red Sox was a dream come true.
We've seen so many big, memorable moments at Fenway Park. So for us to see Quinn out there, it was a pretty surreal moment.
The 5-year-old even met Boston's favorite green monster.
Hey, Wally.
Quinn has been fighting a personal battle. 2 years ago, he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. After months of treatment, doctors found no new evidence of disease. But earlier this year, 2 new growths were discovered.
And it was like getting hit by a truck. We've been through it all before.
Known by his supporters as the mighty Quinn for the way he's dealt with it all.
It's hard to quit with so many people behind you telling you to keep going. He's teaching us all to be brave.
By taking life one day at a time, always with a dream for tomorrow.
Very cool. All right, that does it for this hour. Morning News Now.
But stick with us. The news continues right now.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.